Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History Black History Month Festival. I am Dr. Deirdre Foreman, President of the Manhattan branch of ASALH, and I bring you greetings. Today, we have a special presentation, a panel on how African American families have been portrayed in the media. We have a powerhouse of panelists here with us today who are prepared to share their knowledge and experiences on this topic. But first, we are delighted to introduce Ms. Zendy Clark, who is on the Executive Council of ASALH, and she just so happens to be a member of the Manhattan branch. Please, Zendy, offer your greetings at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As shared, my name is Zendy Clark, and I am a proud member of ASALH's Executive Council and a proud member of the Manhattan branch. I bring greetings on behalf of the Executive Council and welcome you to our Black History Month Festivals program. On behalf of the Executive Council, I thank you for joining us today. And if you are not a member of ASALH, we ask that you please join our organization and help us to continue this important work. We also encourage you to subscribe to ASALH TV, our YouTube channel, in support of our campaign for 10,000 subscribers. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Ms. Constance L. Diggs. Ms. Diggs is the Director of Academic Affairs at Nyack College Alliance Theological Seminary, where she serves on the Dean's Executive Team and is an adjunct professor in spiritual formation and African American history. She is the Vice President of the Manhattan branch of ASALH and a proud product of the Village of Harlem. Her work as a cultural historian and nonprofit professional also led her to develop Brown Diamond, a New York nonprofit. Its mission is to preserve culture and history from the African diaspora for current and future generations. I now present to you our moderator for this afternoon, Ms. Constance L. Diggs.
Thank you, Zendy. We are so happy you are with us today to continue this amazing month-long festival and celebrating Black history. As Zendy shared, my name is Constance Diggs. I am the Vice President of the Manhattan branch of ASALH, and today we want to engage in a dialogue focused on how African American families have been portrayed in the media. To whittle it down a bit more, how have mass communications assets in the United States portrayed the African American family? How has the image of the African American family been distorted, reported, monetized, celebrated, and vilified? One of the tactics of suppression and oppression during the transatlantic slave trade was the demolition of the family unit. Husbands, wives, children, and kinsmen were strategically separated on the auction block, sold sometimes minutes after birth, making the auction poster itself the first mass media consumption of the image of the African American family. Listings on auction posters read like this: public sale of slaves, good washers and cooks, one woman, 27, one very young woman with 3 children, superior men and boys, good field hand, fine bricklayer, skilled tanner, Negroes for sale, a cargo of very fine, stout men and women in good order and fit for immediate service, just imported from the windward coast of Africa. Seasoned Negroes at private sale, a regular bred young Negro man cook, born in this country, who served several years under an exceedingly good French cook abroad, and his wife, a middle-aged washerwoman, both of them very honest, and their 2 children. Now, these descriptions of dismantled families listed as property and sometimes as package deals that included livestock and various farm fixings, are sadly the formative image of the Black family in America. But not all Black families in America during the period of slavery were enslaved. Many were free. Most lived in the North, and by the 1800s, writing became a valuable mass media asset in the Black struggle for freedom and was a tool for reshaping the imagery of the Black family. Freed Blacks were expressing themselves through poetry, slave narratives, abolitionist letter campaigns, anti-slavery speeches, photography, fine art, all contributing to a shift in the narrative and imagery of Black families. Now, though history records the African American ownership of newspapers, media outlets, and an increased presence behind the scenes in television, film, and radio, and the ushering in of social media where the consumer drives content and conversation, the image of the African American family continues to struggle. Exploring how African American families have been portrayed in the media is a large net to cast. So in consideration of today's format and time, we're going to take small bites from 4 areas of focus: the Black family on the small screen, cinema and commerce, monetizing the image of the Black family, the Black family and the American press, and finally, Black millennials reflect on the portrayal of Black families in the 21st century media format. So I'll pass the virtual mic now to Dr. William Sorrell, who will kick off our dialogue with the Black family on the small screen. Dr. Sorrell?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody. I have only a short time to speak, so I want to talk about image. Are images for liberation or are they for control? And I say this because I look at television and I see a lot of images that are negative. When I was a young man, going back to the early 50s, sometimes my mother would say to me, come quick, come quick. I might be in the bathroom or another room. And I come quickly to the TV and I might just miss Sammy Davis or Nat King Cole, who was on a program. And that was really a sad moment for me because we weren't on television and may not be on television again for 6 months or another year. And so what happened was we were so welcoming the opportunity to be on television. We really didn't think too much about the images that we were portrayed as. And so we look at some of these television shows, and certainly we can go into a lot more detail later on, but you look at some shows such as, say, Good Times, where you had the family by name of Evans, you know, the father and the mother and 2 children. And we see that they're hard-working families, a lot of times had trouble financially. But as time went by, the star of the show became JJ, who would do a lot of jokes, wasn't as serious, and it got to the point that the father on the show, John Amos, began to complain. And so the producers decided to get rid of him. So they had him die in an accident. And the mother on the show, Esto Rael, also began to complain about JJ as a character because he had too much attention from the producers. So what happened to her? Well, she remarried and her new husband had trouble with his health. And the family was told, well, the mother can't come back from Arizona where they went because they knew daddy must have that kind of climate. So what are we left with? We left with a family with a young lady who can't cook, a young boy, Michael, who's very smart, but he's very young. And then we have the clown, JJ. So what does that say about our family unit? That a young boy is supposed to be the man of the house. And we look at other shows that went on at that time. 2 in particular come to mind. One was Different Strokes, and the other one was Webster. And here we have 2 young boys who are brought into a family of white people. In the case of Different Strokes, the mother had died and her employer brought in the boys. And so what we get are white people taking care of young Black people, which may appeal to a lot of people. However, the National Association of Black Social Workers said no. They came out against these kinds of adoptions because they felt, in a cultural sense, it was very helpful, not helpful, but harmful to a lot of young people. And so we continue and we see the other shows. Some of the shows were kind of silly, but even they still had a message. I recall one with Monique, the actress, and she had a young daughter, and the daughter somehow passed a test that said she was a high IQ. And the young girl tried to act like she was smart, and finally towards the end of the show, she began to say, "Oh, this is hard being so smart." Then she found out that in actuality, she wasn't really that bright. It was a mistake. So she was really relieved because she said, it's too hard trying to be smart. And you think about, why is that an image of a young Black girl not trying to excel towards academics? I wrote an essay around 1985 on The Cosby Show. Now, The Cosby Show, everybody knows, was a very high rating show, brought in a lot of money to television studios and advertisements. My criticism was, here's a family that's upper middle class, a doctor, a lawyer, well-behaved children, but the show lacked, to my estimation, politics. We never saw the father, who's a physician, never said anything about the health issues in the community at that time in Brooklyn. The wife's an attorney, never said anything about police brutality or the bail system or anything that affected a lot of young people. And my suggestion was, and I sent a letter actually to the producers because I had the essay published in a local newspaper. I sent it to the producers hoping they might address the issue. I never got a reply. And I was thinking about one of the scenes I saw where Bill Cosby, as the father, leaves his son's room, and as he closes the door, you see a poster, "Stop Apartheid" in South Africa. But there's no comments. They could have simply have said, or he could have said simply to the son, "Hey, I see this, what's going on?" "Oh, Dad, I was thinking about going on this protest, should I?" And then he could have said, "Yeah, son, you should, because your mother and I used to go and protest for civil rights." That's all you need to say, about 30 seconds. Or you could have the mother say, "Take care of the dinner tonight, Cliff, because don't forget, this is my night for the law clinic down the street. So I won't be home for dinner." And I know in later years, the show began to have a lot of things around culture. And I understand that Dr. Higginbotham and Henry Louis Gates, I think in 1992, also had a criticism of the show. The fact that it didn't talk about poverty, nor did it talk about discrimination. And so when I think about these kinds of things, what is the image that we have? Does it control us, or does it allow us to be liberated? And one of the concerns that I have is that we don't discriminate in the choice that we make when we watch television. It's there, it's free, so let's watch it. But advertisers pay a lot of attention, and they want to know what's going to sell. And what they do is they tie in our culture in order to sell their programs. And one way that they do this is they bring in the music. So you can have the Temptations, you can have anything from Motown, and they're selling French fries, they're selling Coca-Cola, they're selling hamburgers, so forth. So we watch these shows and we're getting a sense of what other people think we should be like. But the problem is, when we watch these shows, sometimes we begin to internalize what we see, and that's who we think that we should be. So it becomes a dilemma in our communities. I recall someone like Mr. T on the A-Team. And Mr. T was a character who had the haircut, he had the jewelry, and became extremely popular with kids, even had a toy looking like him. And so consequently, kids want to be like that. They thought that was cool. And so I suggest to you, as you watch television, and particularly a lot of the shows that are on shows on television channels that go back 30, 20 years ago. Look at the images, and what do you see? Do you see a family that's wholesome? Do you see a family that's together? Do you see a family that's trying to make progress? Or do you see a lot of people who are just joking, acting stupid? And as a result, that's an image that we see for ourselves and others see us as well. And a lot of these shows now are overseas. It could be in China, it could be in Southeast Asia, it could be in Europe. These people come to America, and they come to America, they're looking for what they saw on television. Mm-hmm. And that's one reason why a lot of people come to America, and they're thinking they're looking for what they saw on Sex and the City. That was popular. Or they come to America, and they're looking for, you know, the cat who's so cool, you know, the hip hop artist. And as a result, they come here, and that's what they're looking for. And that's obviously a misnomer, and certainly is a distortion of who we are as a people.
Thank you, Dr. Sorrell. That is absolutely a brilliant reflection on a contemporary perspective of the small screen, because typically when we talk about the small screen, we go all the way back to Amos and Andy, but not realizing that even in the 20th and even now the 21st century, we've had some challenges with how the Black family is portrayed. We're going to come back more with more insights from you about the small screen, but in consciousness of time and the rest of our panelists, I want to move on to cinema and commerce, monetizing the image of the Black family, that will be presented to us by Dr. Lewis Ray. Dr. Ray?
Hello. I want to look at this topic through two recent films, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom and Sylvie's Love. Both films feature strong Black women as leaders in command of their work and personal space. And the timing of both films, I argue, illustrate a growing commercial interest in African American history and culture, fueled most recently by the Black Lives Matter movement and the interracial global audience it has fostered. Much of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom takes place in a recording studio on a hot summer day in 1927 in Chicago. And the studio is under white ownership, and all the artists who come in there are African American. And they are the musicians in Ma's band: Cutler, a religious trombonist; Slow Drag, the easygoing bassist; Toledo, the piano player and racial philosopher, all of whom arrive to the rehearsal on time. And then following them, coming late, is Levy, the ambitious young trumpet player who sports a new pair of shoes that cost nearly half of what he's going to earn at that recording session. Of even greater significance in the shoe is Levy's musical genius and his ability to actually write songs, and he's composed a hit record. And during this session, he exchanges this hit record to the owner of the studio in exchange for the promise that this owner will make a record featuring Levy. So Levy looks down on Ma's music. He thinks she's old-timey. He thinks her way of handling musicians, the management, white people in general, is old-fashioned, and he has a more up-to-date, more modern, more progressive method of doing so. And he's actually rearranged her version of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom to fit what he feels and what the recording studio owner feels it will match popular tastes, especially of an urban audience, an urban African American audience. But when Ma comes to the studio, she has nothing, will have nothing of it, nothing to do with it. She insists on doing her version of Ma Rainey because that creates a space in the introduction for her nephew to speak the introduction and earn a living as a sideman. And that's something that she promised his mother, her sister, that she would do. And she reminds everybody in the studio that she sells more records for that record company than all the other musicians that in that catalog combined. So the problem that Ma has is that her nephew has a pronounced stutter, and he has difficulty saying the spoken introduction, so much so that the Cutler gives up on him. Levy says he can't do it, but Ma is patient. She does take after take after take until he finally gets it right. And so she creates this framework that provides the support that allows him to succeed. And when he does, she's a consummate artist. She's on it. She rocks her version of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, only to find at the end that the microphone didn't work. It got her voice, but it did not capture her nephew's. So the resolution of the film really turns on whether the nephew will be paid, at least. And does Ma have the clout to ensure that he receives the standard rate as the other musicians in the band? Her manager doesn't want to pay him, and he insists that instead that Ma she's making $200 for the session, which is a handsome sum, that she pay him from her rate as a leader, and she refuses. And she just commands him, get the boy his money. And then all of a sudden there's an about face. The record store owner, the recording studio owner who has contempt for Ma, becomes very pleasant. He wants to get along with her all of a sudden, and he agrees to pay her $225 cash, which includes $200 for her fee and $25 for her nephew. And the reason why he relents, Ma informs us, is because she did not sign the release. So unless he does things her way, unless he records her nephew, he's not going to make any money, and that's why he relents. Levy, goes all over Levy's head, and he believes he understands the white psyche much better than Ma. And what he's done is he gives the record company owner his written score that symbolizes the leverage that Ma has successfully used. And he's shocked that no amount of coaxing on his part, no amount of begging can persuade the record studio owner to record Levy's song with Levy as leader. And the best the owner will do is give him $5 for the song, for all rights to the song, and $5 for whatever he produces. And Levy's humiliated, he's upset, and he's looking for a scapegoat, and he finds that in Toledo, who makes the mistake of accidentally stepping on Levy's new shoe. And when he doesn't apologize the way Levy thinks he should, Levy takes a switchblade knife that he's brandished earlier in the film and plunges it into Toledo's back. So what do we have? Levy's murder costs Toledo's life, Levy's freedom, and facilitates the confiscation of Levy's intellectual property by the recording studio owner. And so at the last scene in the film, we see the studio owner looking down, he's overhead and looking from his office at the recording studio down below, which is full of white musicians, reading sheet music and playing for sheet music and recording Levy's version, Levy's song. Now, I next want to go to Sylvie's Love, which is directed and written by Eugene Ash, which looks at television, not film, and not recording. It's set in New York City between 1957 and 1962, and this film examines the Black family and commerce through the lens of feminism, class, shifting gender roles, loss, absence, over a soundtrack capturing the beautiful music of that period, R&B and jazz, that's supported really by burgeoning youth culture. Sylvie Johnson is the only child of two Black entrepreneurs. Her father owns a record shop and her mother a finishing school for young African American girls. She has a passion for television, comprehensive knowledge of music, a delightful streak of independence, and dreams of becoming, in her words, a Negro woman television producer during an era when the rare racial breakthrough involves African American men, not women. And her parents believe that she's going to surrender all of her freedoms, that her social status and the wealth the family has for marriage, for the obligations of marriage. And Sylvie goes along with that until she meets Robert Holloway, who's a young working class, self-taught jazz saxophonist who actually gets a job in her father's record shop. So they spend the summer getting to know each other, talking with each other, sharing perspectives, sharing worldviews, falling into love. And then Sylvie makes the choice, as Robert gets his big opportunity to go to Europe to record with the band, that she won't tell him that she's pregnant so that he has the freedom to go. So she creates a space so that he can prosper as an artist. And in the meanwhile, she gets married. She also gets a job as a switchboard operator in a television station. And then she learns about an opportunity, an opening for a producer's assistant. she applies and gets the job, and she finds that the person who hires is, of all things, a Negro woman television producer. So Sylvie balances the demands of family and work until her father's death. And that makes her see that she's not happy in her marriage and that she really loves television. She really wants to fulfill herself through her work and that. And she decides to get a divorce because she can't fulfill society's expectations of her wife and be true to herself. So Robert hears of this. The lovely thing about this film is the grapevine. It actually illustrates how the grapevine in the African American community work. Sylvie learns things through her cousin, Mona, and Robert learns information about Sylvie through one of the sidemen in the band, who tells her that Sylvie has divorced, and Sylvie's father tells him that he's the father of her child. Based on that information, Robert reunites with Sylvie, but jazz has fallen in popularity, and Robert finds he cannot get a record deal under his own name, notwithstanding his fame. And he also realizes that his exclusive focus on his musicianship has created an opening for others to copyright, own, and earn royalties from his music. And to make matters worse, he's been so focused on his artistry that he's made few contacts in the business. And he doesn't know that an old neighborhood friend can't actually land him the job in the Motown band as he promises. But Robert's a stand-up guy. His honor won't let Sylvie sacrifice all that she's worked for. And she's now become the producer of a major television show for an uncertain future in Detroit with him. And so he leaves the family on the premise that a family without him is stronger than a family with him. And accidentally, Sylvie finds out about this. And it's a conversation with her cousin that makes her realize that Robert loves her as much as she loves him. And her cousin tells her not to let conventions, not to let society's notions about success, masculinity, or femininity prevent her from uniting with Robert and taking him back to New York to complete their family. So the unfolding civil rights movement serves as the film's background, and Sylvie's character development anticipates the women's movement. Sylvie's love has a fairy tale quality to it and delivers a satisfying "they lived happily ever after" ending. Notably, the conflict in the film that drives the film does not involve the resort to violence. So Ma Rainey's Black Bottom and Sylvie's Love are the result of significant African American involvement in acquisition, casting, production, financing, writing, and direction. The release comes at a time when the market has demanded images of the Black family that break with traditional stereotypes. And these films suggest that the monetization of the Black family in cinema includes significant African American involvement before and behind the cameras, the authentic depiction of African American experience from many points of view, and quality storytelling. Thank you.
Dr. Ray, first of all, spoiler alert, I apologize to everyone who's watching that you gave them everything they needed to know about both Ma Rainey and Sylvie's Love. And a guilty admission, I've watched Sylvie's Love 17 times. I have no problem with saying that publicly. It is so well done. But you've brought out something that I never even considered. I was really wrapped up in the music history behind both of those films, brilliantly portrayed, but the idea of monetization both on screen, dealing with Black families and economy, and then of course behind the scene, we know that there were significant African American production in both those projects. So thank you so much for giving us that both in front of the screen and behind the screen perspective of the importance of monetization of our images on the large screen. Thank you so much for that. And so before we move on to talking to having Josh give his presentation on the Black family and the American press, I want to pause for a second, and I believe we are getting a cue from our production team that we have a brief commercial break. Is that correct? Okay, that's not correct. So Josh, I'm excited that you're here. You represent for us an important part of what I believe the historical evolution of the ownership of African American images in America, and that is the birth of the amazing Black press. I'm so excited that you're here because the Amsterdam News is important on that timeline. So I relinquish the floor to you.
All right, thank you so much for having me on a snowy day here in New York City. We're having a conversation here about how Blacks are portrayed in the media, and while we had the first two presenters, the first two gentlemen talked about Black families presented on the small screen and Black families presented on the big screen. The conversation about Black families represented in the media specifically covers a non-fictional portrayal or a non-fiction image of Black families. And what it kind of boils down to is the way media works is that something happens, somebody has to go get the information is given to you, and then you digest it how you want to. The disconnect comes with how the person interprets the information and gives it to you. And so that's one of the issues that we have when it comes to the portrayal of Black families in the media. I think it's safe to say that mainstream media doesn't do the best job of covering us properly. And I can say so because I've worked in both mainstream and the Black press, and I've seen families covered in certain ways that were not to my liking when I worked in mainstream media. And I'll just tell you how it kind of works. In most mainstream media newsrooms, and that's your mainstream newspapers, your TV stations out there. They usually have maybe a small handful of Black reporters, and that kind of harks back to a whole nother conversation about diversity in our media ranks. And usually when something happens in the Black neighborhood or the Black community, 9 times out of 10, they send us out there. Because I've been on that front line where something will happen in a Black neighborhood or something will happen in public housing. And then they'll immediately call me to go out there and speak to that Black family, which is okay and not okay in some aspects. It's okay in one aspect because I can identify and empathize and humanize the story with that Black family and what they're going through. However, it's bad because it just kind of doesn't allow. It's like the white reporters are sort of dodging the bullet of going to the Black neighborhood, I guess. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that mainstream media doesn't do a thorough job of covering our communities, again, because of the disconnect that the reporters have with Black families. We've all seen, whenever tragedy strikes, whenever something happens in one of our neighborhoods, the news only comes out, mainstream news might only come out when there's a shooting or when there's a robbery or when something negative happens or when crime happens. And of course, to a lot of people, the difference again between the small screen and movies is that news is real. You're seeing a real portrayal and how that's shot, how that story is shot, how that story is written, how that story is cut, how it's edited. It can be taken seriously because it's on the news, and most people do believe what they see on television on the news. And so when we're thinking about stereotypes when it comes to media, a lot of times mainstream media will go out to only cover the negative things, like I said again, and that'll satisfy the stereotypes. Well, the family, a shooting happened in a neighborhood. Well, he had 6 kids. Okay, that's expected. Or where's the mother? Or where's the sister? Where's this? And the image of the family is basically broken down because they like to sometimes see us in our worst. And so that can definitely have an impact on how we're portrayed and how we're perceived. Throughout the years, one of the things I love working at the Black press is that we celebrate family. At the New York Amsterdam News, we celebrate the Black family because we are family. And I mean family in the sense that most Black newspapers are family owned. Mine included. Mine is owned by the Tatum family. Shout out to my publisher, Eleanor Tatum, who might be on this chat. So that's one. And number two, within the ranks ourselves at our publication and in other Black newsrooms, we associate ourselves as family so we can identify. But we celebrate the Black family and the dynamics when the triumphs and the trials and the triumphs. One of the things I always tell people is that being in this business, I've seen a lot. I've seen, my first year on the job at the Amsterdam News was right after the shooting, right during the trial of the shooting for Sean Bell. And one of the things I always say is whenever a tragedy like that strikes, whenever there's an unarmed Black man and a unarmed Black man who's shot by the police, there's always an interesting dynamic to see the family and how they're reacting to it. And I always say that whenever something like that happens, whatever's going on in that family at that time, no matter what it is, it might be a conflict, it might be something that conflict or whatever's going on, it freezes. It's a snapshot because now the family is dealing with this tragedy. And you get different angles from different people, because what reporters will do is they'll speak to the mother, they'll speak to the wife, they'll speak to the sister, they'll speak to whoever was connected to that person, the victim who was shot by the police. And of course, we've seen in throughout the years that news will not necessarily, I don't want to say attack the family, but they'll in some sense victimize the family, saying, well, this shouldn't have happened because of how he was raised, or, oh, this shouldn't have happened because of, his father wasn't around. And so they come to those conclusions about who we are and why we do certain things and why we find ourselves in these situations, so to speak. But the Black press is different. We celebrate the family. We're there when good things happen. We're there when bad things happen. We're there when we lose someone, when folks lose people. And it's just a great place to be when you're able to really empower families and empower people and show people in your own community who they are. We do a column every week in the Amsterdam News called The Black New Yorkers, and we always ask people, send us someone. It doesn't have to be anybody famous. It could be someone in your family, someone in your neighborhood, or two people who are doing something. And we get a lot of families who nominate their family member for a column, and so it's always a joy to do things like that for our community. Also, one of the things that we also try to highlight, family throughout the years in our struggle during the civil rights movement, going back to Jim Crow, and even now, families have always come together to fight together. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of famous families, like the Sharpton family. Al Sharpton, we know him very well, but his two daughters, Ashley and Dominique, are very dynamic in the work that they do. That's a family unit that's fighting on behalf of our community. We were also talking about Sylvia's restaurant here in Harlem. That's a family as well, a family of who has a tradition of, keeps on the tradition of cooking in our community and food and the love that comes with that. So those are just two examples that I can give you of some families that are doing really well. One of the things that I really wanted to talk about with you all is to I always tell people, read various news outlets to get the whole story. What I might write might not be what ABC writes. What I write might not be what the New York Times writes. And so I always tell people to diversify their how they get their news. And the other thing I also tell people, because I was asked to talk about this, was social media and its impact on the Black family. I always tell people to be very careful about what they see on social media. A lot of that stuff, anybody can put what they want out there, and it's very easy to misinterpret something. Social media it's kind of a twofold. One, we're seeing a lot of things that we wouldn't have seen because people are just putting stuff out there and we wouldn't have known about it. But there's also a drawback because a lot of the stuff is false and untrue. And of course, people are also being selective in what they see. If they see, something happening online or a meme, a very popular video that portrays Black people in a stereotypical way, people are going to look at that and say, hey, that's just how they are. But then in the flip, we see a lot of great positive things on social media that celebrate and empower our Black families, whether it be business, whether it be art, whether it be through celebration, through religious. We see a lot of different various things on social media. So there's kind of a twofold there when it comes to how it's impacting, how social media is impacting the image of our Black family. I was also asked to talk about how the different experiences based on different generations. And the fact of the matter is that families have changed over the last 100 years. The Black family has changed over the last 100 years. And that is because of the various societal impacts that have had lasting, depressing impressions on our community. One of the things that we talk about in Black Family this month is the impact of slavery. We talked about that at the beginning of this session, about how families were broken up, and that was one thing societal wise that was impacting families back then. Right now, we have certain things such as health disparities, incarceration, and law enforcement that are having a very, very negative impact on our families, taking out our fathers, sending them to prison, taking our mothers and sending them to prison. High rates of incarceration are having a profound impact right now on our Black family. And before I wrap up, there is one thing that I did want to say while I was here. We are talking about family this month, Black families. And ASALH did a wonderful job of going down the various lists of the types of families that we're talking about this month. And there's one area that we don't really talk about too much, and that's the blended family. And the blended family is so important because, if I don't know if you all know this, but 17 to 20% of children in this country are living in Black children, Black and Hispanic children, 17 to 20% of Black and Hispanic children are living in a blended family household, meaning they're living with somebody who is a stepmother, stepfather, step-parent, or half brother, half sister. And that dynamic has such an impact on a child. I can speak for myself because I am a product of a blended family. Both of my parents divorced when I was in the first grade, and they actually both remarried people from big families. So that extended my reach even further and extended my garden even further, my tree even further. And so I'm hoping that while we continue these conversations about the dynamic of family, we must talk about the impact of the blended family. And that's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much. And I'll be answering questions as we move forward.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. I want to point out, first of all, I want to say thank you to our audience. I do see some questions in the chat. I want to get our panelists to present in their respective areas, and then we're going to curate your questions immediately. But I want to just point out with the Amsterdam News and other Black-owned newspapers, you're correct. You know, what we report about is a little bit more close to the heart than what a mainstream publication will report about, because we have closer access. But I think it's also important to point out that newspapers like the Amsterdam News and other Black-owned or Black-focused publications also are some of the curators of our images. For instance, you know, as a cultural historian and researcher, I go to Cornell or to the Schomburg or to the library, and some of the images that I see that go back as far as 1920 are from the Amsterdam News. And the Amsterdam News has its own, for those of you who are scholars watching, if you're ever interested in anything New York, I urge you to go to either Schomburg or to the Cornell University resources, because there are magnificent images as well as older clippings of the Amsterdam News that can help fill in some of the blanks. Those types of images may be kept by a larger publication like the New York Times, for instance, or maybe the Washington Post. But if it were not for some of our Black publications, a lot of Black photographers would not have had their first go at being journalists, photojournalists. And so that is another, I think, important contribution that the Black press makes when it comes to preserving and curating the images of our Black families. Thank you, Josh. We'll be coming back to you for some more input. Moving on to a young lady who quite honestly is representing a generation that is moving us expeditiously into a format that, how can I put it, is giving more power, as Josh put it. Don't believe everything you hear on social media, but the 21st century media platform gives more power to the person who is behind the media, as opposed to those who are feeding the media from the press perspective. So Ms. Asia Harris from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center is with us today. And she's going to speak to us about Black millennials reflecting on the portrayal of Black families in the 21st century. I know that's a lot of pressure that you're speaking for every Black millennial, but we think you can handle it.
Okay, I'll do my best. So happy Super Bowl Sunday to everybody. And I just wanted to start off with the definition of media. And this is from Merriam-Webster. And there's a few different definitions on there, but this was my favorite one in reference to how I'm going to be speaking on media. So medium or media is a medium of cultivation, conveyance, or expression. So I read that so we can remember that the media can be represented in multiple different ways. How many different ways do we see the Black family reflected on our screens, in books, the internet, movies, art, newspapers? All of these outlets are here for us to share what's going on in our families, and they give us a place to share how we see each other in the world. So the media is really beginning to represent more Black families, but I think that our country has a really long way to go in terms of reflecting the identity of Black families that feel authentic to us. So our media really needs to do better at exposing the lifestyles and experiences of Black people in America and around the world. America seems to have a very narrow perspective of Black families in our media. And I'm a writer, so as a filmmaker, my first thoughts on media are, what do I see on TV and film, and how is the press telling our stories? Because going back to what Josh said, the difference between, TV and film is that the press is real. So how are the stories that we are experiencing in real life being told? So in the age of, the internet and streaming, millennials have the luxury that there's more different media types to choose from for learning and entertainment that represent our families more than any other generation has ever had. And the definition of family, once again, like back to what Josh said, is different for everybody. So some people might feel like, the media is biased in everything. Some people might feel like, what, this is TV, this isn't real. I just want the best people, I don't care if they're Black, white, Indian, Latina, if they're not good, let's choose the best people. But I think it's important for us to have trusted resources, because going back to the press, those are real stories. So we need to hear about how those stories are happening from people in those communities. And, if there's only a limited group of people who can become the speakers for a culture, then the truth and the perspectives get skewed about, what's really happening. So I think that people sometimes can miss the point between representation and talent, and they're two different things. We need to see representation within talent, because that's what's necessary. And if certain programming and information is designed to uplift and empower certain groups, that doesn't mean that other groups in society are being left out. So at the same time, I believe that, access to equipment and being able to create your own platform has really elevated independent creators, and artists are making the material that they want to see for themselves. And mainstream media is realizing that they're going to miss out on talent and dollars if they don't get these trends of what independent artists are doing. So a lot of these, major companies have had control of the media industry for so long, and leadership has looked the same across the board. Now, in some of these companies, we're starting to see the decision makers and, the top dogs changing. For example, for MSNBC, their new president is a woman. She's a Black woman. She graduated from a historically Black college and university. Down the line, I'm sure that's going to change the perspective of what gets put on TV, who gives permission on what people want to see. So, we look at stories that we've all fallen in love with that have like a millennial perspective within the, let's say, like 5 years. Watchmen, Lovecraft, Queen and Slim. You mentioned Sylvie's Love. I watched that movie several times myself, and I love Tessa Thompson. I think she's amazing. So, I think we just really need to take a look at what are the different ways our families are being reflected. The representation needs to include past stories in all walks of life from today's society to see what we've overcome, right? So America's foundation is really violent, and it has been very oppressive. So that plays a role in who holds the power and how we approach our reflection on the Black family in media. So Black families have been torn apart for centuries from racially systemic practices put in place in America. And economically, that's led to Black families not having leadership over who gets to create and reflect our portrayal of Black family. Going back to what we've kind of said this entire program, monetization, ownership, representation. How do we get our hands on those things ourselves? Our media industries need to reflect all of the lives that, people leave or that people lead. On TV, we see a lot of broken homes, addiction, troubled children, single, strong, independent Black women. But, there's plenty of artists, creators, and journalists who don't live that perspective. And there's plenty of stories being put out about those different perspectives, but they don't get the same funding, the same highlight from major markets, the same marketing. And once again, leading back to what I said about media, it's different things. It's newspapers, it's our magazines, it's the billboards, it's the food that we eat. All of those things represent, us. So these major power structures that have been the gatekeepers aren't able to really monopolize the media industry in the same way because the access to media has changed. And people can create materials and footage, like I said earlier, that they really want to see without having to rely on big business to do that for them or give them permission or give them the resources. So, you have people like Tyler Perry. He's opened up his own groundbreaking studio. Tiana Taylor has just opened up, or she's in the process of opening up her own production company. Issa Rae, we see she's a mogul now. Nipsey Hussle, he has passed away, but look at the legacy that he's left for independent artists. People like Sam Cooke, they really have led a blueprint for artists to create, these major industries for themselves. And now we have access to these major industries. So that's not to say that we don't want to be on HBO, we don't want to be on Showtime, etc. But that means that when we get into these spaces, we really have to stand our ground on how we want our families to be represented. If a company is saying, hey, I want the family to look like this, or hey, I want your story to look like this. If that's not your story, then go somewhere else. That we see that there's so many outlets and opportunities for us now. We don't have to be really pinned in the same place that we have been for so long. So when it comes to like racial segregation, for example, my grandparents were born in the 30s. They're 86 and 87 years old, and segregation ended in the 60s. So you had Loving versus Supreme Court in 1967. My mom was born in 1970. So even though I'm not a millennial, we have to look at the direct relations that we have in our generations to the generations that felt the legalized oppression in this country. Both of my grandparents spent their entire childhood in segregation. So what did that do to their Black families? That's my Black family. What does that do to all of the Black families around us? And what happened to those stories? Who tells those stories? And segregation lasted for a really long time. So just for example, there's so many dark eras within American history, but there still was love and light, in those spaces. So how can we pull those stories out? And how can we find people who are creators who can really intersect, the idea of information and entertainment so that our families really feel represented? And personally, we all mentioned that I work for the Freedom Center here in Cincinnati. And when it comes to kids getting involved with this work, I think it's about making it interactive. They really want to make change. Kids want to be involved. They want to know what's going on. They always have questions. And when we look back at something that's really common among people is kids love story time. And really, these images and media is all about stories. So how can we incorporate, these stories and this information to make kids want to get involved with this information? They're playing video games, they're on social media, they're watching TV, and all of those things are kind of thrown in their face, and that's fine. So how can we take advantage of what's being thrown in their face and put our images in these spaces, and our images on the TV? So just to really close out, I want to ask people in the comments, let's leave some comments on what are our favorite channels of media. Do we like movies? Do we like TV? Do we like newspapers? And how do we gain ownership and access into the decision-making processes in these fields? So like I said in the comments, let's just talk about, what are our favorite movies? What are the favorite TV shows that we like? Earlier we spoke on Good Times. Why don't we necessarily relate to those images? Well, that's because we don't feel like that's our story. So after today, I think we can really encourage each other to come together and have conversations about what's happening in your family. What has happened to your family? Do you feel like what you see on TV and the newspaper and the press represents your family? And then go from there. Now that we have access, we don't have to really be put into these boxes that we once had to get into just so we could get our feet in the door.
Asia, thank you. I had no doubt that you would represent your generation well, and you absolutely did that. We're going to curate some questions. There's several in the chat, but I want to just highlight you lifted up some names, Issa Rae, Tyler Perry, and Tiana Taylor, all three of whom, interestingly enough, started off as independent artists before even getting into mainstream, quote unquote, music, media, especially someone like a Issa Rae, who literally produced her show on YouTube and now has, turned down deals from certain networks because she could do that, but now has an opportunity and has produced shows on HBO. So that really does affirm what you've shared, that the gift that millennials have is that they have the access to create content. And not just millennials, we all do have the access to create content. And so what does that mean as we drive forth this conversation about the image of Black families in the media? So I want to go to some of the questions that people have been patiently waiting for us to address. And so I have one question here. Quite a few. So the one question that was asked is, what are elements to look out for in TV shows and other media that misrepresent the Black family? This is for the entire panel. So anyone can take this question. So what are elements to look out for in TV shows and other media that misrepresent the Black family?
I'd like to answer that question.
Yes, sir.
I think that America is trying to be too progressive about race, but then they get misguided on what they should, how it should be represented. So there are a lot of shows now where you have the Black family or the Black guy is the best buddy. And what happens though is if the Black guy is the best buddy to a white family, you never see the Black guy with a Black family or Black friends himself. So as a consequence, it appears that that the only people in his life are the neighbors next door who are white. So you don't hear anything about his cousins or his boyhood friends or anything that represents a connection with other African American people. But people consider this as being somehow progressive because it shows interracial cooperation. But I think that's kind of misguided because it doesn't appear to be a reality to me.
It's interesting that you say that, Dr. Ray, because, historically, there have been 6 dominant stereotypes in both television and film when it comes to African Americans, and that's the domestic, the magical Negro. We saw that when we saw The Green Mile, the Black best friend, as you pointed out, the thug, and then of course the angry Black woman, my favorite, and I'm really joking and being sarcastic, and then of course the sexualization of Black bodies. So it's interesting that you bring that up, because not only is that something that we've experienced historically, but it continues. I want to move on to another question so we address as many questions as we can from our audience. The next question is for you, Dr. Ray. Do you think it's significant that both films you mentioned were on a streaming service and were not widespread theatrical releases?
Yes, I think the very point that Asia just raised, and I think it's great. I think the more diversity we have and the more options you have in terms of producers, people to get things out, the more the merrier. That's what I say. That it doesn't. I think that too many mainstream producers think they have too much control. They think they know more than they do. And they're really interested in monetizing things, leveraging content to the maximum. So they could do story A, but they don't think story A would pay enough, so they would prefer to do story B, even though sometimes they would know that story B is not a true portrayal. So yes, I think that it's no accident that it's come through streaming services. And I think that's where Black subscribers have exerted leverage, because it's just like focus groups. They're collecting data all the time as to, well, they know you're watching it 17 times, they know.
I know, that's why I watched it 17 times, so they can put more of that formatting and programming rather on Amazon. I love it. I probably watch it 17 times more.
Yes, we watched all the Nollywood stuff we could get our hands
Yes.
on, so it's showing that there's this huge market
Yeah.
for content that somebody like a Netflix or an Amazon or Hulu will purchase because they want to, their business is just like, they want to expand their subscription. They want to keep subscribers and expand their subscription base. So
and what's interesting too is that many both independent and even known producers and personalities are contracting and partnering. For instance, former President Obama and Michelle Obama, I believe, inked a deal with HBO, if I'm not mistaken, a production deal with HBO. And there's been more and more of these instances of Black and Brown production companies being able to craft these deals with some of these, I don't want to say not mainstream, because mainstream to me is kind of a blurred line right now with all of these different platforms that you have. So another question from our audience, from Robert Simmons. Would you comment on the TV show Blackish on ABC, please? Thanks. We haven't heard from Josh, so I'm going to throw this one to Josh. Would you comment on the TV show Blackish on ABC, please? Thanks. That's from Robert Simmons.
Yeah, I'm a semi-regular watcher of the show. I think it's a good show. Kenya Burris has done a phenomenal job with that show and the spinoffs. There are 2 spinoffs from that show. One of the things that I like about that show is that it, for one, the starring character is a HBCU graduate like myself. So I love that they're incorporating that. Although the daughter didn't go to a Black college, I wish we could have gotten that in there, but we didn't get that. But what I do like is the fact that they are addressing kind of to the opposite of what the gentleman's name, I can't remember it right now, Dr. Searle. I know you very well. I've seen you over the years, Dr. Searle. I don't know, I forgot your name just now. But no, back to what he was saying, the Cosby Show, like he said, I grew up during the Cosby Show. I grew up watching that show every Thursday night on NBC. That was the routine back in the late 80s and early and in the 90s for our family, was watching the Cosby Show. But you're right, there wasn't he's right, there wasn't really a very strong portrayal of the issues that were going on at the time. America was experiencing Rodney King at the time when the very last episode came, and Bill Cosby only addressed it when the final episode was on. They didn't address it in the show. I remember that. And as comparing it to Blackish, if you see, there are several episodes that do talk about Black Lives Matter. There was one episode that I love, I think, about the black hair. The youngest daughter was trying to get her hair done, and there was a whole issue about that, so it showed that. But one of the things I will say about Kenya Burris in the show Blackish and Mixedish is that it's evident that he likes to put a white dynamic in there. The lead character in the show, Tracee Ellis Ross, is a biracial person, leading the way for white characters to kind of come into the show. But at the same time, Mixedish, which has one of my favorite stars from Saved by the Bell, Zach, and the young lady, I can't remember her name, is on that show. Great show, but it's also bringing in white audiences to kind of see a little bit of a different view of what's going on in Black America. I do think that some of the portrayals are a little bit, I don't want to say extreme. The son's a little kind of like a 21st century version of JJ for me a little bit, because he's a little off, but the show is good. I think it's a great show that's addressing a lot of topics and bringing in a lot of conversation. Hopefully they keep it going. I think they just started their newest season, and I have a positive view of the show, but I say it's pretty good overall.
It's interesting that you make that connection between the Cosby Show and Blackish, and it is extremely evident that there's more of a boldness. And I don't know if it's because Kenya Barris is behind the show. I mean, in addition to the segment where the youngest daughter was struggling with her hair, even issues like voting, they produced, a cartoon segment with the Roots, connecting a whole other generation to this show. And using the Roots to do, I guess, a nod to, Conjunction Junction and all those.
Rock. Yeah, I remember that was
Schoolhouse Rock, which I watched all the time.
As did I back in the 90s
really
when it came back.
A cartoon, speaking to Asia's comment about creating things that will engage young people. So this show is as much entertaining as it is accountable to bring these interactive elements into it to talk about current issues. Like they broke down how a law and, you know, how we deal with police brutality and all these things in very lighthearted ways, but in ways that you can comprehend. And I don't want to say take the seriousness out, because the seriousness is still there, but in a way that is palatable for young people. So one more question here from Folarin. I don't want to mess up your name. I'm just going to say Folarin. I won't mess up your last name. It's interesting that you also mentioned that the main character of Black is from an HBCU, because Folarin is asking that very question. What about African American news coverage? What about African American news coverage will do better to showcase HBCUs?
You want me to answer, or
you can start, and then someone else can certainly take.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, I'm a graduate of an HBCU. I graduated from Alabama State University in Montgomery, Alabama, and everybody knows around the newsroom, even on my radio shows. And I was even introduced earlier today when I did a show. You know, I am the ultimate HBCU advocate. So there's information about HBCUs. We definitely need to do it. But I will tell you this: I am in my newsroom. I am there. We have 2 reporters, 2 editors. I'm the only one who's actually a graduate of an HBCU. And until recently, I was the only HBCU graduate in my newsroom at the Amsterdam News, until we brought on someone who's only going to be with us for a little while. And you know, that's nothing against the Amsterdam News. That's nothing against them. We have a very rich history when it comes to HBCUs. In fact, the large majority of our writers previously came from Howard University and other schools. And in our sports department, we have actually quite some HBCU graduates as well. But you know, one of the things about for a long time, that was the only place you can get HBCU news was in newspapers. Black newspapers rather, and even still today, we are still a driving force. You see it here in New York. We do stuff up here because we try to keep it local. So whenever something HBCU happens, but keep in mind, there's not that many Black colleges in New York City. So you'll see news about HBCUs happening. But as far as like day-to-day things that are happening on a regular basis, you know, we're not going to have that. We'll have it in the Amsterdam News, but not on a real often basis, only because we don't have that many Black colleges here in New York. But we do talk quite frequently about HBCUs. I can say that we do, only, you know, because I'm there. And how can Black newspapers do it better? I think it's establishing a relationship. One of the things I always tell people about news is we don't know what's going on unless you tell us, because somebody will call me up and say, hey, you didn't have so-and-so and this and that. And I said, well, we didn't know about it. You know, if we don't have it, we don't know about it. So I always tell, you know, all schools, HBCUs, to make sure that you're in touch, not just with mainstream outlets, because a lot of times they may or may not cover you, but Black newspapers, Black publications are definitely going to be covering you. So always keep us in the loop. So it's all about relationships.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I will chime in on it. I went to an HBCU as well. I went to Hampton, and I am a really major advocate for HBCUs, especially coming from a predominantly white high school. You just really get a completely different experience and exposure when you come from, you know, one demographic to be exposed to another demographic, even if it's your own. You know, if I wasn't raised around very, very many Black people, or if I wasn't in school systems where we were really included, then there's probably not going to be a lot of people that are, you know, advocating for our stories. And there's not going to be a lot of people who even realize that they're missing, because everyone is alike, you know? So when you look at like the more mainstream media, you know, the top 10 schools that you can name right now, you know, off of your head, they're probably going to be, you know, predominantly white institutions. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but how can we really popularize HBCUs? How can we emphasize why it's important to go to HBCUs? Once again, referring back to my grandmother, who went to Bennett College, at HBCU in North Carolina, she went there because she couldn't go to the white schools. So, you know, let's look at the legacies that these schools have left. It's great for us to be welcomed into certain spaces, but let's also continue supporting the institutions that were created for us, by us, and are still being run by us, because that's where we have, you know, the built-in control already. So let's take advantage of the resources that we have and really, really build up our networks to see if we can create platforms that are just as large as, CNN News or, Universal Studios. If we pull our resources together from, these small different HBCUs all over the country, then I think we might be surprised at the quick amount of progress that we can make within our communities.
I want to look at a couple of questions that we curated for today, and we have more questions from our audience, and I certainly don't want to misstep with any of them. But I want to ask the panel if they can chime in specifically at looking at what do you think is the greatest strength today? Early on, when we opened up, we talked about some of the ways that media, and thank you, Asia, for defining media, because I really wanted us to take a look at media from that viewpoint. All of those many ways that we express ourselves, mass media is what I was looking at. So with that regard, and looking through the lens of how we've defined media for our talk today, what is the greatest strength of African American media today as we continue to struggle with the image of the African American family? What would you say, if each of you can just share, what do you think is a great strength, one great strength and one great weakness of African American, the portrayal of the Black family today?
Well, I would say that the great asset of the African American media is to hit the news that other people neglect to talk about. As a historian, I've done a lot of research in African American newspapers, particularly a time period from about 1830 to 1930. Because I found a lot of issues were covered there that either were not covered in the mainstream publications, or it was distorted. And so that's really helpful because, just give you an example, if you're reading, say, in 1850 about New York City education, and if the local African-American newspaper talked about schools, and they might give the name of a principal of a public school, and they might even name some of the teachers or even some of the students who did outstanding work. Whereas in the white papers, they're talking about darkies, about darkies, and not saying anything really positive about education for our people. So you get that in the African-American press at that time. Same with like lynchings. It's the African-American press that's going to dominate the fact that there are lynchings going on almost weekly in the United States at certain time periods. Whereas the white press may only emphasize one or two throughout the year that was very sensational. Whereas we know that they were pretty common. Now, I think a weakness of the African-American press is money. They don't have the money to pay salaries. And so consequently, someone who feels like they're ambitious want to go and work for, say, New York, the Post or the Daily News or New York Times or Newsday, because they're looking for that income. And so as a consequence, people who might have the talent are not using that talent in our publications. They're using it in mainstream, and the mainstream may only have them there as a token. And so as a consequence, they are not benefiting, and certainly we're not benefiting. I'm sure Josh has a lot more insight since he worked in both areas.
Yeah, I do. I can definitely piggyback on what you're saying. Our strengths, of course, I always tell people is our relationship with the community. We can cover a story a certain way while the Daily News or the New York Times will cover it another way. And it's because we have the relationships that are strengthened, that have been strengthened over the years that we've been there. The Amsterdam News this year, we were founded in 1909. So that was even before the Daily News was founded. So we're even older than them, and certainly not before the New York Times, but before the Daily News. So we've been around for so long. We were founded ironically the same year as the NAACP in the same city, around the same time. A lot of people don't know that. But our strength is our relationship and our long-standing and the trust. I can always also say that too. People trust us, and they look to us for dynamic information and great things. We did a phenomenal cover this weekend, or rather this week, that just rather last week on Thursday of Cicely Tyson. Cicely Tyson was born and raised in Harlem. We were her hometown newspaper, and we had to do something special for her. So we got people were calling us even right after she passed away, asking, "What are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?" And we had put the stories online, and we had a great front cover. You can pick it up now. It's also on our website too. And so we did that. The drawback is two things actually. Number one is what Dr. Searle said about the finances. We're most Black newspapers, including ours, we always ask people for one to always subscribe, because we do, that's the way you can support us. We are a Black business. That's what I always also tell people about the Black press. We're a Black business. So there's this conversation, this thing going on right now around the country about support Black businesses, support Black this, buy Black that, and that includes news media. You have to support Black media. You have to advertise with Black media. If you're a product or a person or have an organization or a company, come to us. We have great rates. If you're a political candidate, come to us and advertise with us. The last thing, number 3, is access. It's interesting. I tell people a lot of this, and I'm actually starting to do a little more. And it's the fact that even a lot of our own folks won't even talk to us for some reason. I'm not going to name names, but there are a lot of Black politicians who, if we call them, it takes them forever to respond. If it takes them forever to respond to us when we're asking questions. But if we're a mainstream outlet, they get it quickly. And it's just a real shame that a lot of times that I get a lot of folks that come to me and say, "Oh, I had my story in the New York Times. Hey, can you do it?" And I'm like, well, it's already done in the New York Times and it's already out there. What are we going to add that's differently, and why are you coming to us last? So make us first. Put the Black press first with everything that you do, because we're going to portray you the right way. The Daily News and the Times will love you today, but if you screw up, they're going to hate you tomorrow, and they're going to talk about it. I see you laughing, Asia. You know what I'm talking about. The white press will do that to you. So I always tell people, respect us, come to us. We are your family. We are your people, and we love you.
I wanted to comment on that.
Go ahead, Asia.
Real quick. So, like I said, I'm here in Cincinnati. I think everyone else is in New York, Cincinnati, Ohio. And we have a local Black newspaper here as well, the Cincinnati Herald. And it's, I believe, the only Black-owned newspaper in the region. And back to what you said, Josh, we have to remember that media is money, whether it's a magazine, a movie, Facebook, whatever. These companies have to be able to make money in order to generate content and footage. So if we don't spend money, if we don't give them support, then they're not going to have a platform to use for us. So let's really, like you said, spend our money with them. Let's figure out how we can collaborate with other businesses. We see a lot of excitement when we get partnerships with these major brands, Nike or, just any big, huge brand that you can think of. And it's great that we are collaborating with them as well, but let's keep things grassroots. How can we collaborate with the other business that's, on the other side of your neighborhood? How can we sell more newspapers in, the local gas station? Because newspapers still sell, but are we buying newspapers? And are we showing these companies that we have the desire to get this information? You look at a company like the Shade Room and how much, how many followers do they have? Millions and millions. And every single day, people are taking in that content. So obviously there's a need for it and people want to know what's going on. So how can we use Black media to express that and put money in their pockets so that they can tell our stories creatively? Because as we all know, movies are very, very expensive to make. So that's.
Thank you. We have so many great questions coming into the chat, and I'm struggling with which one to ask first because they lead into each other. So I'm going to start with this one, especially since it speaks to our founder, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And I don't know how many, I know how many among our panelists probably read The Miseducation of the Negro, but in it, Carter G. Woodson really points to a lot of things economically, socially, community-wise, and even the family as to how we can galvanize around this issue of our image, but through a lens of us using education. It's really a thoughtful work that challenges the reader to look at how education knits and weaves through every aspect of our life. And so Dr. Bruce Purnell has asked, it would be great to look at the media through the lens of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. What would you say about it that relates to the miseducation of the Negro? Meaning, what does the image of the family in the media, how does that relate to this manifesto that we have with us from Dr. Woodson concerning the miseducation of the Negro. No one wants to answer that question?
I'll answer. Okay, go ahead.
Dr. Ray?
Woodson, Dr. Woodson believed that one of the favorite examples I have is he talked about the purveyor of a hot dog stand in Harlem who grew it into a major hotel chain. And he said that we tend to look for mainstream things instead of looking at what's around us. That's what he felt was one of the big errors that African Americans made. So, and I think that is really true. I think we really do overlook our talents, our abilities, our skills, all the wealth and beauty that we have as a culture. We kind of take it for granted maybe, and think more highly of that which we were taught in school. And we have to remember that we're not really taught much African American history in school, even in college. I know, and this is, it amused me because it's a familiar story. I know of a student who told me that when he told his uncle that he was decided to major in Africana studies, his uncle was driving his car and he pulled the car off the side of the road and vomited. And I said, wow, that's a familiar story, because I've heard that story time and time again. And I said, wait a minute, how do all these guys end up driving on the road, end up pulling it over? But he made his point. And the point is that he sent him, the family sent him to school to study something else, to not study about himself. When I think Dr. Woodson would agree that to understand yourself is the beginning of all things and the beginning of wealth.
Thank you for that. I have a question that I'm timid to ask, but I know and I'm hoping that it will lead into one of our closing questions because we're getting close to our time. I have a question from Wendell Love, and he is asking, what does the panel have to say about the Tyler Perry portrayals of Black family life?
I'll take a stab at that. He believes in redemption. I think he has I think one of his powers and the reason why he's so prolific is that he really has this idea about, he described it once, how he takes a story through a cycle, but he really believes in redemption. And I think that's something that, we make mistakes. You have to figure out that you made a mistake. You have to figure out how to ask for forgiveness. And then the community has to forgive, but you don't have to forget. But there should be some type of forgiveness. And I think that's a simple cycle that he's taken, a really straightforward storytelling cycle that he's taken and used very, very effectively. I think it's at at the core of much of his work.
Thank you, Dr. Sorrell. Anyone else?
I do want to comment. I just remember when Tyler Perry was starting out and he was just doing the plays. And he was, because I remember I was living in the South at the time, and he'd come to our campus, and well, not our campus, but come to Montgomery, and they would do the plays on our campus. They were very hilarious. So I think he's successful in that aspect. Here's the thing about Tyler Perry. Tyler Perry has never won an Academy Award, but he is the biggest movie maker in the country right now, probably the world, if not the biggest, one of the biggest. And one of the things that has made him so successful is that Tyler Perry has tapped into a lot of issues that people aren't talking about that are happening to families. If you notice, in a lot of his films, they address a lot of the kind of ills that are happening, like abuse, betrayal, cheating, infidelity, things like that, and doing it in a very humanly way. And because he himself was a victim of abuse, and so he was able to bring that out, and people were able to kind of identify in some aspect, not everybody, but a lot of people were able to identify. And I think that's one of the things that was so successful about his work. And even in the television shows that he does, again, I've seen him from the beginning. I remember when he used to come, do the plays, go to the next city, go to the next city, and then you'd have the DVDs. And now, right now, here it is 10 years later, and he is, probably the largest movie maker, production house in the country, in the world. And so I think that's something that definitely should be congratulated. But I think, again, tapping into those issues of family that we often don't want to talk about are being portrayed on screen. And so I think that's something that's really helping with his success.
Thank you. We're going to curate another question from our panel. There's still so many that are here. And so I have a question that I am going to generate to Dr. Sorrell because it has to do, hold on one second. Mainstream has also neglected to include, and I want to put a caveat here, Dr. Sorrell. I'm not asking this question because you're one of the more seasoned panelists here, but the question is, mainstream media has neglected how older family members are portrayed. You did a beautiful job of connecting us to some of our former shows and even your experience as a young person watching television. So we would be really interested in hearing how you would respond to this question. How mainstream media has neglected to include older family members on their shows?
Well, I just think it's a reflection of society in general. Old people get dismissed because they're old. People have a tendency to believe that once you hit a certain age, you're no longer a contributor. And as a result, people get ignored. I do appreciate some things out of the Cosby Show. I mean, certainly the grandfather in the show had a lot of wisdom, and certainly he could tell that to the younger people. And I think what's necessary is to see how people had lived their lives and what kind of contributions they had made to society itself. One thing I regret myself, because I'm at the age now where I didn't talk to my parents about their lives, and I should have, like 50 years ago, because now I have all the questions I should have asked when I was like 20 years old. And I'm not getting asked those questions by my children or grandchildren because I'm old. They don't think of me probably in that regard. But we have wisdom. We have certainly a lot of experiences. And I think television and movies could capitalize on that kind of experience. Sometimes my son might ask me something about civil rights because I'm old enough to have gone through that time period 50 years ago. And I can tell him what I knew at that time or what I felt at that time. But it's very informal. It's not like something that we talk about every day. It's not something you're going to see normally on a television show. But I think a lot of mistakes that young people make would not be there if they just ask questions of older people. Just how should they behave under certain circumstances? I always told my son, like, don't act stupid in the streets because you never know what someone has in their pocket. And he almost got killed in Atlanta when he was around 19 years old because he confronted somebody who had an argument with a friend of his, and the guy pulled out a gun and started shooting. And fortunately, he didn't hit anybody, but he certainly scared the hell out of people. And he could have been killed at age 19 in college because he was too macho, because he didn't listen. So I think these kinds of incidents could be avoided, certainly if they're put out on television shows where an older person could say, when I was young, I made this mistake, and see what happened to me. I used to give lectures at a federal prison called Otisville back in the 80s. And a lot of the men I met were young men when they went to prison, and they'd be old men when they get out, if they ever get out alive, because they didn't listen to their elders about how they should behave and how they should conduct themselves around other people. So I think television has an opportunity to do this. They can do it in a way that's full of humor, but get the point across that old people have knowledge and old people should be listened to.
Thank you for that, Dr. Sorrell. It's interesting because immediately when you shared that experience and exchange with your son, I couldn't help but think about on the large screen, Boys in the Hood, and the exchange between, which is a cult classic from a generation that, we call the hip hop generation because of all the characters that were in there, and certainly John Singleton, who is no longer with us, but certainly impacted storytelling about families and that exchange between the father and the son in Boys in the Hood. And then when I think about the talk that took place on the Blackish show. And so staying in the vein of these shows that features young Black men and especially from the hip hop generation, if we look at I would be curious to hear reflections about the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Got a lot going on there. Josh, you talked about blended families. You talked about Asia, about, you know, this younger generation having a platform, and Will Smith, although he started off in hip hop, he has now transitioned into being a huge influencer as well. And the monetization that you brought in for us tonight, Dr. Ray, and certainly with you, Dr. Sorrell, I'd love to hear, what did you think about that show and its impact that it's had both on the small screen and the large screen, and the image of the Black family? Dr. Sorrell, you lifted up the fact that there were these professionals on the Cosby Show, but they didn't talk about real issues. What would you say about that on The Fresh Prince?
Well, you had Phil, Uncle Phil, a judge, very successful. You can tell how he lived and how he conducted his life. But I recall one incident where he was saying, just because I have all this money and I have all these opportunities, how did I start? And what happened to me? And what can still happen to me? And I don't remember the incident. I don't know if it dealt with being stopped by the police or something of that kind of nature, but he was basically saying, I'm still a Black man, and I'm still being perceived as a threat by some people, and particularly the police. I thought that Will Smith's character made it really real for his cousin Carlton, because Carlton was basically a Black conservative who believed in law and order and thought that he was above being singled out by law enforcement, because he was good. He was a good man, good boy. And Will said, "You're stupid, man." And I think they had an incident where they got stopped by the police, and Carlton thought he could just, get away with whatever they were trying to say he did. And he began to realize he was just a Black man too, in the eyes of the law. So I think those kinds of issues were relevant, because unlike the Cosby Show, it showed that just because you're a professional doesn't mean that everything is safe, that things can happen to you like it can to somebody who's uneducated and who doesn't have the same means, because a judge, in his case, Uncle Phil, is not always a judge in the street. And I think
exactly
the same thing you have from a lot of athletes today. A lot of athletes are famous and wealthy, but they're not recognized all the time, and they get pulled over and things happen to them where they may be mistreated, may be abused, because the person didn't see the football or the basketball or the baseball star. They just saw a Black man.
Thank you. Anyone else on this topic before we move on? Our time is winding up. We only have a few minutes left to our segment. Still focusing on, this impact of family and television and film. I lifted up The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, but if there are any shows that stand out to you that allowed us to have this duality of what the Black family looks like, blended family. Yes, Josh.
Yeah, I did want to say briefly, there was something that Dr. Sorrell said earlier, and that was that we often look at TV shows to see how we should be acting. And so, a lot of times I remember growing up in my time, the number one show at the time, some of the number one shows at the time were Fresh Prince, that was a hot show, Family Matters, which never talked about anything political or racial. They had one episode where there was a racial incident between maybe two. There was one with Eddie when he was stopped by a police officer, and then there was one with Laura when the N-word was sprayed on her locker. And that was maybe two times where race was actually discussed during that show. And then of course we had another show, 227. Y'all remember that show, right? But it was so stereotypical. The gossipy Black women, sassy Black women on the stoop gossiping about people living in Washington, D.C., and the teenage boy at home living with his grandmother. Where were his parents? That type of situation. Good family, but it was a very stereotypical show, unfortunately, but hilarious. I will say that. But we laugh at this, and that's what I also think is that a lot of these TV shows we criticize so much, but they are fictional. At the end of the day, they are not real. But for a lot of people, you know, a lot of folks can't distinguish what's fake and what's real. So they see portrayals of us in a certain way and they expect for us to be that way. So if you're living in, I'm just going to name a state, Iowa, where there's not a lot of Black people, and your only portrayal, your only image of Black people is what you see on the news and not in real life, or what you see on sitcoms, or even more further, we haven't talked about this, reality shows and the impact that that's having on our people. I'm not even going, we'd be here all day if we could talk about that. And I'm surprised no one mentioned that, but the impact that the reality TV shows are having on our folks. But how we see ourselves is so important. And so there's never, you know, I used to watch television shows and think, hey, we don't do that in my family, or we don't do that here. And I guess maybe thinking there was something wrong with me, or there was something lacking in my family dynamic. I'm not sure. But it's always good to be able to, one, get a laugh, but we have to make sure that we distinguish to folks what's real and what's not.
Thank you. We are at our time. We only got a couple of minutes left. And so I want to do something that I love doing back in my quote unquote journalism interviewing days. And I want to ask you a question that I would like for you to answer in one word. So in the early 1900s, pioneering scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, E. Franklin Frazier, they all lifted up these structural evolutions of what the African American family looked like up until that time. And so our founder, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and his Miseducation of the Negro, which was asked about tonight, made this statement. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which was our former name as an organization, is projected on the fact that there is nothing in the past of the Negro more shameful than what is found in the past of other races. The Negro is a human as other members of the family of mankind. So if you had to speak to the cultural gatekeepers of our history today, what one word would you say to them about the Black family today that you would like our audience to ponder on as we consider the images of the Black family in the media?
Survival.
Thank you, Dr. Sorrell. Survival.
I would say integrity.
Integrity.
I would say empathy.
Empathy.
Resilience.
Resilience. Thank you so much to our panelists today. Thank you all for joining us. I apologize if I didn't get to any of your questions. As you can see, this was a rich conversation, and we really touched the tip of the iceberg of the conversation about the image of the Black family in the media. If this is your first time here on ASALH TV, click that subscribe button and the notification button so that you'll always know when something is going to appear on ASALH TV. If you want to learn more about ASALH, our founder, and the things that we're doing, if you're in New York and you want to join this chapter, you got to join the national first, but we're always here in Manhattan virtually right now until we get out of this pandemic, or you can look for a local ASALH chapter where you are. But to learn more, go to ASALH, www.asalh.org. So we're going to close our time together with the HBCU choir musical performance of Old Time Religion by Morgan State University. Thank you to our panelists and viewers. Have a wonderful day.
We would like to thank our sponsors for today's event, our legacy sponsors, the History Channel, AARP, Bank of America, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, Omega Life Membership Foundation, New York Life, and Johnson & Johnson. Our cultural sponsors, TD Ready Commitment, and Merck, and our History Maker sponsors, Fort Myer Construction and United Bank.